April 1945. The war in Germany has ended, but its presence lingers everywhere. In the ruins of a small town in the American occupation zone, children stand cautiously near a collapsed wall. Their clothes are oversized, salvaged from older siblings or strangers. Their faces are thin, their movements restrained. For years, they have been taught discipline, suspicion, and fear. Play has not disappeared. It has simply changed shape, becoming quiet, cautious, and brief. An American patrol enters the street. Not rushing, not shouting, rifles slung low, helmets dusty from the road. The children do not run, but they do not approach either. This is the enemy they were warned about, the soldiers who defeated their country. Then something unexpected happens. One soldier bends down and rolls a ball across the broken pavement. Another produces a deck of cards. Laughter, hesitant at first, cuts through the silence. A game begins, improvised and simple, played among rubble and shadow. For these children, raised on air raid sirens and propaganda, the moment is disorienting. Victory was supposed to mean punishment. Occupation was supposed to mean fear. Instead, it begins with play. And in that small, fragile moment, the psychological aftermath of war begins to reveal itself. By the spring of 1945, Germany's military defeat was complete. On May 7th, German representatives signed the Act of Unconditional Surrender, ending 6 years of total war in Europe. The physical destruction was immense. Entire cities lay in ruins. Transportation networks were shattered. Millions were displaced. Among them were an estimated 10 to 12 million German children, many of whom had known nothing but war for most of their lives. From an early age, these children had been shaped by a tightly controlled environment. The Nazi state placed extraordinary emphasis on youth indoctrination. Schools, youth organizations, and even recreational activities were mobilized to serve ideology. By the final years of the war, children were not only targets of propaganda but, in some cases, participants in the conflict itself. Older boys were pressed into anti-aircraft crews, courier duties, and, during the last months, the Volkssturm. Younger children absorbed fear through air raids, evacuation, and the constant presence of uniformed authority. When Allied forces crossed into Germany in early 1945, they encountered a civilian population psychologically exhausted and deeply conditioned. American military planners were aware of this. Pre-invasion briefings warned soldiers that German civilians, including children, might be hostile, suspicious, or emotionally withdrawn. The fear was not unfounded. Years of propaganda had portrayed Allied soldiers, particularly Americans, as brutal and dangerous. Occupation policy initially reflected this uncertainty. The early directives emphasized control, discipline, and non-fraternization. U.S. soldiers were instructed to maintain distance from civilians. Friendly interaction was discouraged. This policy extended to children as well. The concern was both ideological and practical. Close contact could undermine authority, create favoritism, or blur the line between victor and defeated. Yet reality on the ground quickly complicated these rules. The collapse of German administration left vast gaps in daily life. Schools were closed or destroyed. Youth organizations were dissolved. Parents struggled to secure food, shelter, and safety. Children spent long hours unsupervised, moving through ruined streets, railway yards, and bombed-out neighborhoods. They were visible everywhere, scavenging, watching, waiting. American soldiers encountered them daily. These encounters were not planned. They happened at checkpoints, near field kitchens, beside convoys halted by damaged roads. Children watched soldiers eat unfamiliar rations, handle equipment, and speak a language they did not understand. The curiosity was mutual. For many American servicemen, often young themselves, German children did not resemble the enemy they had imagined. They looked hungry, cold, cautious. At the same time, the U.S. Army was undergoing a rapid transition. Combat units became occupation forces almost overnight. Infantrymen were reassigned to patrols, guard duty, and civil order tasks. Military government teams began assessing food distribution, housing, sanitation, and public health. Child welfare emerged as a recurring issue in these reports, not as a moral abstraction, but as a practical concern. Malnourished, unsupervised children posed risks to themselves and to stability. The non-fraternization policy began to strain under these conditions. Soldiers were instructed not to give food, yet they were surrounded by children clearly in need. Some followed orders strictly. Others bent them quietly. By late spring and early summer of 1945, reports from the field indicated uneven enforcement. The rigid boundary between occupier and civilian was proving difficult to maintain, especially where children were concerned. Within this environment, informal interactions began to occur. Simple gestures, shared moments, sometimes unintentionally play. These moments were not officially sanctioned, nor were they coordinated. They emerged from proximity and circumstance. A ball tossed absent-mindedly. A game improvised to pass time during a long halt. A group of children lingering, watching, slowly inching closer. Such encounters carried weight far beyond their simplicity. They challenged expectations on both sides. For German children, raised to associate uniformed authority with command and punishment, the sight of enemy soldiers engaging without threat was unsettling. For American soldiers, these interactions humanized the aftermath of victory in ways no briefing could convey. As these encounters multiplied, occupation authorities were forced to confront a question they had not fully anticipated. How should an occupying army relate to a generation shaped entirely by war? The answer would evolve under pressure, experience, and necessity, setting the stage for a quiet but significant shift in the nature of occupation itself. As the summer of 1945 progressed, the gap between occupation policy and lived reality widened. Germany was no longer a battlefield, but it was far from stable. Food shortages persisted. Housing remained scarce. Public services functioned unevenly, if at all. For children, the end of combat did not immediately bring safety or structure. In many areas, it brought uncertainty. The Allied Control Council dissolved Nazi institutions quickly and deliberately. Schools were closed pending denazification. Youth organizations such as the Hitler Youth were banned outright. While necessary, these actions left millions of children without formal supervision, education, or organized activity. Streets, ruins, and open fields became their primary spaces. Idle time increased. So did risk. American military government officers began to note this in their assessments. Reports from U.S. zones repeatedly mention children congregating near supply depots, checkpoints, and troop billets. The concern was not sentimental. It was operational. Unsupervised youth increased the likelihood of accidents, theft, disease spread, and unrest. Stability depended on restoring routine. At the same time, American soldiers were adapting psychologically to their new role. Combat had ended abruptly. Many units had expected redeployment to the Pacific. Instead, they found themselves policing, administering, and observing a defeated society. The emotional intensity of combat gave way to a slower, more ambiguous occupation. Interactions with civilians, especially children, became one of the most visible expressions of this shift. Despite official guidance, informal contact increased. Soldiers shared chewing gum, chocolate, and cigarettes, items that quickly became symbols of American presence. Children learned this rapidly. They watched patterns. They tested boundaries. Initial fear softened into curiosity. In some places, children began to follow patrols at a distance, mimicking movements, watching expressions. Play emerged naturally within this environment. American soldiers brought with them habits from civilian life. Baseballs, playing cards, simple games used to pass time during long deployments. In ruined German towns, these objects stood out. When a ball was thrown or a card shuffled, it introduced something unfamiliar, an activity not tied to ideology, drill, or survival. For German children, play had been constrained and regimented for years. Spontaneous games with foreign soldiers fell outside anything they recognized. The psychological impact was significant. Studies conducted later by occupation psychologists noted that children responded more quickly than adults to shifts in behavior and tone. They were sensitive to gesture. A smile, a relaxed posture, or laughter conveyed safety more effectively than orders or assurances. When American soldiers engaged children through play, even briefly, it disrupted deeply ingrained expectations. From the American perspective, these moments also carried weight. Soldiers who had fought through France, the Ardennes, or across the Rhine now found themselves interacting with children who spoke the language of the defeated enemy. The contrast was stark. These children did not represent ideology or threat. They represented the consequences of total war. By late summer, occupation authorities began to reassess strict non-fraternization rules. In September 1945, U.S. policy was formally adjusted. While discipline and authority remained central, limited, supervised interaction with civilians was no longer categorically discouraged. The rationale was practical. Stability required trust. Trust required visibility of restraint. Within this revised framework, child-focused initiatives began to appear. Military government units supported the reopening of schools, youth centers, and recreational spaces where possible. American-run or supervised programs emphasized structure, hygiene, and basic social interaction. Games and sports became tools not for indoctrination but for normalization. These developments did not erase suspicion. Many German parents remained wary of occupation forces. Trauma did not vanish with surrender. But children responded differently. They adapted quickly to new patterns of behavior. Where soldiers engaged without threat, children reciprocated without fear. The presence of play within occupation settings became a quiet indicator of change. It signaled that violence had receded, even if hardship remained. It suggested that authority could exist without constant coercion. For children who had grown up under sirens and slogans, this distinction mattered deeply. As these interactions accumulated, they began to influence broader occupation thinking. Child behavior became an informal metric of stability. Where children played openly, security incidents declined. Where fear persisted, tension followed. The occupation was entering a new phase, one shaped not only by policy directives, but by daily human contact. And within that evolving landscape, the role of children, and the simple act of play, would take on meaning far beyond its modest appearance. That shift would soon be examined through multiple lenses, revealing how one unexpected behavior exposed deeper truths about victory, authority, and recovery. The human angle. For German war children, the occupation was not experienced through proclamations or policies. It was experienced through daily encounters. Hunger, cold, absence, and, gradually, through unexpected moments that contradicted everything they had been taught to expect. Many of these children had spent formative years under constant instruction: what to fear, what to obey, how to behave. Play, when it existed, was organized, monitored, and ideological. Spontaneity had little place in wartime childhood. By 1945, even informal play had been replaced by scavenging, helping parents survive, or simply staying out of danger. When American soldiers engaged children through games, tossing a ball, improvising simple contests, laughing openly, the reaction was often confusion before relief. These were not gestures of authority. They carried no command, no punishment, no demand. For children conditioned to associate uniforms with discipline or violence, this behavior was deeply disorienting. Psychologists working with occupation authorities later observed that such moments provided children with something essential but rare in post-war Germany: predictability without fear. A game had rules, but those rules were temporary and harmless. Losing carried no consequences. Winning carried no responsibility. In a shattered environment, this distinction mattered. For many children, these encounters marked the first time the war truly felt over. The psychological angle. The psychological impact of play extended beyond the children themselves. It altered perception on both sides of the occupation line. Years of propaganda had portrayed Americans as brutal, vengeful, and morally corrupt. Children absorbed these narratives uncritically. They had little reason to question them. Their experience of Allied air power had been destruction from above, faceless and terrifying. Ground troops were imagined as an extension of that force. Direct interaction challenged this image immediately. Soldiers who knelt to eye level, shared food, or participated in games contradicted expectations more effectively than any re-education program. Fear did not disappear instantly, but it fractured. The certainty of hostility gave way to ambiguity. For American soldiers, the psychological effect ran in the opposite direction. Combat training and experience emphasized dehumanization of the enemy as a survival mechanism. The sudden presence of children, speaking German, wearing patched clothing, visibly undernourished, disrupted that conditioning. These interactions forced soldiers to reconcile two realities: the enemy they had fought and the civilians now standing before them. Children, in particular, made that reconciliation unavoidable. They embodied consequence rather than threat. Letters home and unit diaries from the period reflect this shift. Soldiers wrote less about victory and more about responsibility. Less about enemies and more about conditions. Play, trivial as it appeared, became a symbol of normalcy returning. Not because it erased suffering, but because it acknowledged humanity. Occupation psychologists later identified such interactions as stabilizing factors for both populations. Reduced fear among civilians lowered tension. Reduced hostility among troops lowered incidents. The occupation became more manageable not through force, but through familiarity. The tactical angle. From a tactical perspective, child behavior offered valuable insight into the effectiveness of occupation measures. Military government units monitored public order closely. Incidents of theft, vandalism, and unrest were logged and analyzed. Patterns emerged. Areas where children gathered openly, playing, interacting with troops, moving freely, tended to show fewer security problems. Where children remained hidden or fearful, instability persisted. This correlation was not accidental. Children are sensitive indicators of environment. They do not calculate risk strategically. They respond instinctively to safety cues. When children felt secure enough to play in public spaces, it suggested that violence, repression, and unpredictability had diminished. Commanders began to recognize this informally. Patrol reports increasingly referenced civilian atmosphere rather than just compliance. Observations such as children present in streets or civilian demeanor relaxed appeared alongside traditional metrics. Play also served a practical function. It drew children away from hazardous areas, rubble piles, supply depots, damaged infrastructure. It reduced scavenging near military equipment. It lowered accidental injuries. In this sense, games were not merely symbolic. They were preventative. Occupation policy did not explicitly mandate recreational engagement, but it tolerated it. And in some districts, it quietly encouraged it. Youth activities were easier to supervise than unsupervised movement. Structured normality reduced risk. Thus, what appeared to be casual behavior aligned with strategic objectives. Stability, order, and cooperation were reinforced not by intimidation, but by routine human interaction. Through these three lenses, human, psychological, and tactical, the significance of play becomes clearer. It was not a distraction from occupation duties. It was part of how occupation evolved from control toward stability. Other angles would soon emerge, examining how leadership, morality, and the defeated population's perspective further complicated this transformation. For American commanders responsible for occupation zones, maintaining control while preventing collapse required constant adjustment. Orders issued from higher headquarters often emphasized discipline, non-fraternization, and distance between occupier and occupied. These directives reflected legitimate concerns. Authority had to be preserved, resentment managed, and former enemy populations prevented from exploiting leniency. Yet leadership on the ground confronted a more complex reality. Junior officers, company commanders, and military government officials reported conditions that could not be addressed through regulation alone. Children were omnipresent. They appeared near checkpoints, supply convoys, and reconstruction sites. They were not hostile. They were curious, hungry, and often alone. Leadership decisions increasingly relied on discretion. While formal policies discouraged close interaction, enforcement varied. Commanders recognized that rigid application risked alienating civilians and increasing tension. Quietly, tolerance replaced prohibition. As long as order was maintained, small human interactions were allowed. Some leaders went further. After-action reports from late 1945 and early 1946 indicate that certain units actively used informal engagement to reduce friction. Soldiers were instructed to remain calm, visible, and predictable around civilians. Children were not to be chased away unless safety required it. This approach was not sentimental. It was pragmatic. Occupation leadership understood that legitimacy could not be imposed indefinitely by force. It had to be observed. When children no longer fled from uniforms, it suggested authority was being normalized rather than resisted. Leadership thus evolved from issuing commands to managing atmosphere. This shift did not weaken control. It strengthened it. The enemy perspective angle. From the German civilian perspective, especially that of children, the occupation unfolded without context or explanation. Defeat was absolute, but its meaning was unclear. Children had been raised on narratives of strength, sacrifice, and inevitable victory. Collapse arrived suddenly. Air raids ended. Sirens fell silent. Soldiers disappeared. New uniforms appeared. The American soldier was an unknown quantity. Fear dominated initial encounters. Children had learned to associate foreign troops with danger. Early occupation reinforced this uncertainty. Armed patrols, curfews, searches, all were reminders of defeat. But daily exposure gradually eroded abstraction. Play accelerated this process. To a child, behavior defines intention more clearly than language. A soldier who plays does not intend harm. A soldier who laughs does not seek punishment. These conclusions were drawn instinctively, not intellectually. This did not mean trust replaced fear overnight. Children remained cautious. Parents warned restraint. But the absolute image of the occupier fractured. Americans became individuals rather than symbols. This change extended into households. Children spoke of encounters. Parents listened, skeptical but attentive. Over time, civilian perception softened not through persuasion, but through accumulation of experience. For a defeated population struggling with shame, hunger, and uncertainty, these moments mattered. They suggested that the future might not consist solely of humiliation. That defeat did not mean annihilation. In this sense, children became conduits of psychological transition. Their reactions reflected shifts occurring beneath the surface of civilian society. The moral angle. The moral implications of these interactions were complex and often unspoken. American forces represented a nation that had fought a brutal war against an aggressive regime responsible for immense destruction. The moral clarity of victory did not erase memory. Soldiers carried the weight of lost comrades, atrocities revealed, and devastation witnessed across Europe. Engaging with German children forced a confrontation between justice and mercy. These children were not perpetrators. They were products of circumstance. They bore consequences without agency. This reality challenged simplistic moral binaries. Playing games did not absolve guilt or rewrite history, but it acknowledged distinction. It recognized that responsibility for war did not extend equally across generations. This distinction had ethical significance. It demonstrated restraint. It reflected an understanding that punishment directed indiscriminately would perpetuate harm rather than resolve it. Occupation authorities never framed such interactions in moral language. They were not intended as forgiveness. Yet their effect was moral nonetheless. They signaled limits to retribution. For soldiers, this carried emotional weight. It allowed a measure of reconciliation without forgetting. Humanity could be expressed without compromising accountability. In later years, historians and ethicists would examine these moments as examples of post-conflict responsibility. Not because they were dramatic, but because they were ordinary. They showed how power could be exercised without cruelty. Intersections and consequences. These angles did not exist in isolation. Leadership discretion enabled human interaction. Human interaction reshaped enemy perception. Enemy perception influenced stability. Stability reinforced leadership confidence. Play became a quiet thread connecting policy to outcome. It reduced fear. It normalized presence. It allowed children to reclaim fragments of childhood. And it allowed soldiers to transition psychologically from combatants to occupiers. These effects were subtle but cumulative. They did not end hardship. They did not resolve trauma. But they created space for recovery to begin. As these interactions multiplied across occupied Germany, they contributed to a broader transformation. Occupation was no longer defined solely by control. It was defined by management of a fragile peace. That evolving reality would soon intersect with larger forces: winter hardship, reconstruction demands, and shifting international priorities, pushing the occupation toward a decisive turning point. By the autumn of 1945, the occupation of Germany had entered a critical phase. The fighting was long over, but peace had not yet taken shape. Across the American zone, the early improvisations of occupation were colliding with the realities of time, weather, and scale. What had initially been tolerated as informal, soldiers helping civilians, engineers assisting families, children interacting freely, now demanded definition. Winter was approaching. Meteorological reports warned of an early cold season. Fuel shortages persisted. Housing repairs lagged behind need. In many towns, children still slept in unheated rooms, cellars, or partially collapsed structures. Illness increased. Medical units reported rising cases of respiratory infection and malnutrition among minors. The consequences of hesitation were becoming measurable. It was at this moment that American occupation leadership faced a decision point. Control alone was no longer sufficient. Improvised goodwill alone was no longer enough. What had begun as scattered human gestures now required coordination, authorization, and intent. The turning point did not arrive with a single order or declaration. It emerged through accumulation. Field reports from military government units began to converge. Different regions reported the same pattern. Where interaction with civilians had been restrained, tension remained high and cooperation low. Where engagement had been tolerated, even encouraged, conditions stabilized faster. Children returned to streets. Families remained in repaired dwellings. Order improved. This correlation forced reassessment. Senior commanders in the U.S. zone recognized that occupation policy could not remain reactive. Stabilization had to become proactive. The well-being of civilians, particularly children, was no longer a secondary concern. It was a metric of success. In late 1945, directives expanded the scope of civil affairs operations. Engineer units were authorized to prioritize residential repair alongside infrastructure. Military government officers received broader discretion in managing civilian interaction. While formal non-fraternization policies remained on paper, their enforcement softened in practice. This shift marked the true turning point. Occupation was no longer defined solely by preventing German recovery. It was now tasked with preventing German collapse. For soldiers on the ground, the change was tangible. Patrols shifted emphasis. Security remained firm, but predictability replaced intimidation. Civilians were not only controlled, they were managed. Children remained central to this recalibration. Medical officers were instructed to track child health as an indicator of environmental stability. School administrators were consulted about reopening damaged facilities. Reports increasingly included references to youth behavior, attendance, and public presence. This was not sentimental policymaking. It was empirical. Children responded faster than adults to environmental change. Their behavior reflected safety levels honestly. Where they played, stability existed. Where they hid, fear persisted. American leadership began to understand that rebuilding trust did not weaken authority. It legitimized it. The symbolic weight of this shift was significant. For months, children had watched soldiers cautiously. Now they watched consistently. Soldiers returned to the same streets, the same routines, the same behavior. Consistency replaced uncertainty. Games continued. Informal interactions persisted. But they now existed within a broader framework of reconstruction and administration. Play was no longer an anomaly. It was part of a visible transition from war to order. This moment did not erase resentment or hardship. Hunger remained. Housing shortages endured. Grief was unresolved. But the direction of occupation had changed. The Americans were no longer just victors maintaining dominance. They were administrators shaping outcome. This realization carried weight beyond Germany. Observers within Allied command understood that the treatment of German civilians would shape Europe's future balance. A population stabilized was less likely to radicalize. A generation of children given structure rather than fear was less likely to inherit resentment. Thus, the turning point extended beyond immediate conditions. It became strategic. As winter tightened its grip, the consequences of this shift would be tested brutally. Intent would face reality. Policy would face weather. Humanity would face scarcity. And the true measure of the occupation's transformation would be revealed not in orders issued, but in whether children survived the cold months ahead. The winter of 1945 to 1946 arrived without mercy. Across central and southern Germany, temperatures dropped sharply. Snow accumulated on roofs already weakened by bombing. Fuel shortages deepened as coal production failed to meet demand and damaged rail lines slowed distribution. For civilians, especially children, the margin between endurance and disaster narrowed to days. This was the moment when occupation policy ceased to be theoretical. Medical reports from the U.S. zone grew increasingly urgent. Children suffering from bronchitis, pneumonia, and frost exposure filled makeshift clinics. In overcrowded shelters, disease spread quickly. In partially repaired homes, families burned scrap wood and furniture to keep rooms barely warm. American commanders could no longer rely on limited repairs or informal measures. The scale of risk forced commitment. Emergency winterization programs were expanded rapidly. Engineer units were reassigned from secondary tasks to civilian housing stabilization. Rubble clearance intensified, not for long-term rebuilding, but to prevent collapses under snow and ice. Roofs were reinforced. Windows were sealed. Heating systems, where possible, were restored. These decisions carried cost. Manpower was diverted. Supplies were strained. Military priorities were adjusted. Yet leadership accepted the trade-off. The alternative, mass civilian suffering, threatened not only moral standing but security itself. Children remained the clearest indicator of success or failure. Occupation authorities tracked child mortality closely through medical channels. Where housing repairs progressed, illness declined. Where shelters remained exposed, cases rose. The pattern was unmistakable. In response, directives emphasized speed over completeness. Buildings did not need to be restored. They needed to be survivable. Temporary solutions multiplied. Damaged schools were repurposed as heated shelters. Undamaged military barracks were converted into family housing. Civilian labor was organized under supervision to accelerate output. German municipal officials, vetted for non-affiliation, were permitted greater autonomy in allocating space. This represented a decisive shift in trust. American leadership acknowledged that control without cooperation would fail under winter pressure. Local knowledge mattered. Civilian participation became a necessity rather than a concession. On the ground, soldiers witnessed the consequences directly. Patrols passed families sealing windows with cloth. Children gathered near work sites, watching repairs with quiet attention. The earlier moments of play had not vanished, but they were now framed by urgency. Games still occurred, but now beside construction work. Laughter existed, but alongside exhaustion. The symbolic meaning of these scenes was profound. The same uniforms that had once advanced through battlefields now worked to prevent roofs from collapsing on children's beds. The contrast was not lost on either side. By early 1946, the effects of this commitment began to surface. Medical units reported declining rates of exposure-related illness among minors in districts where winterization had been completed. School attendance, though limited, increased where buildings were made usable. Public order improved measurably as survival pressures eased. These outcomes validated the shift. Occupation leadership concluded that stabilization could not be postponed until long-term recovery plans were finalized. Immediate action shaped long-term consequence. Each child protected from winter exposure represented not only a life preserved, but a reduction in future instability. This realization extended upward through command structures. Reports emphasized that reconstruction, even at a basic level, produced tangible security benefits. Areas where children returned to school and families returned indoors required fewer patrols. Tension declined. Cooperation increased. The winter had forced clarity. Reconstruction was no longer an adjunct to occupation. It was its core. For German children, the turning point was experienced without terminology or policy awareness. They felt it in small, concrete changes. Rooms that stayed warm through the night. Floors that no longer flooded. Days that followed routine. These experiences mattered. They reshaped memory. The war, which had dominated childhood through fear and disruption, was now receding, not because it was forgotten, but because something else was taking its place. As winter loosened its grip, the occupation emerged transformed. What had begun as victory enforced by control had become stability sustained by responsibility. The question now was not whether reconstruction would continue, but how its consequences would unfold. And with that question, the occupation moved into its aftermath, a phase where outcomes, rather than intentions, would define legacy. By the spring of 1946, the immediate crisis had passed, but its effects were clearly visible. The winter had tested the occupation's resolve, and the response had altered conditions across much of the American zone. Housing remained scarce and often inadequate, yet the difference between survival and collapse had been established. Roofs held. Heating functioned sporadically but reliably enough. Families were no longer living entirely at the edge of exposure. For children, the change was measurable. Medical reports compiled by U.S. Army units recorded declines in respiratory illness and cold-related mortality among minors in districts where emergency housing repairs had been completed. Clinics that had been overwhelmed during the winter months reported fewer acute cases by early spring. These were not abstract improvements. They reflected lives stabilized. Public order shifted alongside health. Military government officers noted that as survival pressures eased, civilian behavior changed. Theft of fuel and materials declined. Curfews were violated less frequently. Patrol encounters grew calmer. Where families had shelter, desperation receded. Children again served as indicators. In neighborhoods where reconstruction had progressed, children returned to streets during daylight hours. They gathered near reopened schools, repair sites, and supply distribution points. Their presence signaled something fundamental. Fear was no longer the dominant force shaping daily movement. Education resumed unevenly but decisively. Across the U.S. zone, damaged school buildings were repaired or repurposed. In some cases, instruction took place in former barracks, municipal halls, or partially restored classrooms. Attendance fluctuated, constrained by food shortages and transportation limits, but the return of structured learning marked a psychological milestone. For children who had lived through years of interruption, routine itself became an anchor. This return to schooling had secondary effects. Parents regained time to focus on reconstruction and employment. Community networks slowly reformed. The occupation administration found that areas with functioning schools experienced fewer social disruptions. Perception of the American presence evolved accordingly. Initial resentment and suspicion did not disappear. Memories of bombing and defeat remained sharp, but observation softened judgment. Reconstruction was visible and consistent. It could be measured in repaired buildings, reopened streets, and safer living conditions. Civilians judged outcomes more than intent. Children played a central role in this shift. Their visible recovery, better health, regular movement, participation in school, provided tangible evidence that occupation was not solely punitive. For parents, this mattered more than rhetoric. American forces, too, experienced transformation. Soldiers who had transitioned into administrative, engineering, and civil support roles reported greater clarity of purpose. The ambiguity of occupation gave way to defined objectives. Stabilize, repair, prevent relapse into chaos. Morale reflected this shift. Letters home increasingly referenced rebuilding rather than fighting. This did not erase the weight of the war, nor did it diminish awareness of German responsibility. But it reframed the mission. The aftermath also revealed limits. Housing shortages persisted. Refugee inflows from the east continued to strain capacity. Rural areas absorbed displaced families faster than resources allowed. Recovery was uneven and fragile. Occupation authorities acknowledged these constraints openly in reports. Reconstruction had reduced risk. It had not resolved it. The population remained dependent on external aid. Food rationing continued. Infrastructure repair lagged behind demand. Yet the direction was clear. Stability had replaced emergency as the dominant condition. The occupation had moved beyond immediate survival toward managed recovery. For children, this shift defined memory. The war's end was no longer solely associated with silence after bombardment or the arrival of foreign troops. It was increasingly linked to concrete improvements, warm rooms, open schools, predictable days. These experiences shaped how a generation would interpret defeat and peace. As the occupation settled into this new phase, attention turned to what these outcomes meant beyond Germany itself. The choices made under pressure now carried broader implications: strategic, moral, and historical. Those implications would become clearer as the long-term consequences of Reconstruction began to unfold. By the late 1940s, the visible scars of war remained, but their meaning had begun to change. Rebuilt houses stood beside ruins left intentionally untouched. Streets carried both new pavement and shattered stone. For German children growing into adolescence, the landscape itself became a lesson in cause and consequence. Destruction was not erased. It was contextualized. Occupation policy evolved accordingly. American administrators increasingly framed Reconstruction not only as stabilization, but as prevention. The logic was explicit in internal assessments. Societies left in deprivation bred resentment, extremism, and future conflict. Children, identified early as a vulnerable demographic, became central to long-term planning. Programs expanded beyond emergency relief. Youth centers were reopened under supervision. Sports leagues emerged with military support. Libraries and cultural spaces were restored selectively, filtered through denazification guidelines. These initiatives were not symbolic gestures. They reflected an understanding that post-war peace depended on normalcy as much as control. Children who had once been taught obedience without empathy now encountered authority that emphasized structure without intimidation. This contrast left a deep impression. Oral histories collected decades later reveal recurring themes. Former war children recall confusion during the earliest encounters with American soldiers, fear mixed with disbelief. They remember games played cautiously at first, then freely. These moments did not rewrite history, but they complicated it. Enemy behavior no longer matched expectation. That cognitive dissonance became formative. It weakened absolutist narratives inherited from wartime ideology. For many, it represented the first break with propaganda they had absorbed without question. Policy outcomes reflected this psychological shift. As West Germany moved toward political autonomy, the foundations of cooperation had already been laid at the local level. Familiarity with American systems, schooling methods, administrative processes, civic norms, eased integration into broader Western structures. This was not accidental. Reconstruction in the American zone deliberately emphasized visibility. Repair projects were conducted openly. Aid was distributed publicly. Interaction between soldiers and civilians was regulated but encouraged. The goal was credibility through presence. Children observed this daily. They watched streets return to function. They attended schools where band symbols were replaced with neutral instruction. They learned routines not defined by alarms or marches. These experiences did not absolve the past. Responsibility for the war remained a subject of national reckoning. Trials, denazification courts, and public accountability continued. But Reconstruction ensured that this reckoning occurred within a functioning society rather than a collapsed one. The long-term effects extended beyond Germany. Occupation practices refined during this period informed future American policies in post-conflict environments. The emphasis on infrastructure, youth engagement, and visible cooperation became models referenced, sometimes imperfectly, in later decades. The transformation was not uniform, nor was it immediate. Some children carried trauma forward. Some families remained resentful. Reconstruction could not undo loss or erase memory. It could only provide conditions under which recovery was possible. Yet those conditions mattered. For a generation raised amid ruins, the presence of former enemies engaging in ordinary, human behavior altered how peace was understood. It became tangible, could be seen, touched, and participated in. As these children matured, their memories formed a quiet counterweight to narratives of hatred and inevitability. And in that balance between memory and rebuilding, the final meaning of occupation began to take shape. History often records wars through borders changed and armies defeated. But for those who lived through the aftermath, meaning was shaped in quieter spaces. For German war children, the end of World War II did not arrive with treaties or speeches. It arrived in fragments, in ruined streets, empty classrooms, and unfamiliar uniforms. Their earliest memories of peace were not abstract ideas. They were moments, small encounters, unexpected gestures. American soldiers did not erase fear overnight. They could not. Trauma lingered in silence, in hunger, in absence. Yet the presence of former enemies behaving with restraint, and sometimes kindness, disrupted what these children had been taught to expect from power. That disruption mattered. It introduced ambiguity where certainty once ruled. It suggested that authority did not always demand submission. That victory did not always require humiliation. For minds shaped by total war and absolute ideology, this realization marked a turning point. Reconstruction was never purely material. Bricks and roads restored movement, but interaction restored possibility. The games played in shattered streets did not change the outcome of the war, but they changed how its ending was absorbed. They humanized the occupier without erasing accountability. They allowed memory to coexist with renewal. This balance became central to post-war Germany's transformation. The generation that grew up under occupation would later inherit a nation rebuilt not only through economic aid, but through sustained exposure to alternative values, cooperation over domination, civic responsibility over obedience, reconstruction over revenge. World War II demonstrated humanity's capacity for destruction on an unprecedented scale. Its aftermath revealed something quieter, but no less significant: the deliberate effort to prevent that destruction from repeating. Peace in this context was not declared. It was practiced. It emerged in supervised schools, repaired homes, shared routines, and yes, in moments of play between children and soldiers who had once stood on opposite sides of history. These moments did not absolve the past. They shaped the future. And in doing so, they remind us that the true end of war is not marked by silence on the battlefield, but by what replaces it afterward.